Welcome to the Good Chemistry Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Jikomis, and today I'm speaking with science writer Carl Zimmer. Carl is an award-winning New York Times columnist and the author of over a dozen popular science books. His latest book is Life's Edge, The Search for What It Means to Be Alive. Carl and I spent most of our time discussing this new book, which centers around the question of what living things are. The book explores historical examples of scientists grappling with this question of what the essence of living things actually is. It goes into various exotic forms of life here on Earth and how they work, as well as questions around how life originated on Earth and the hunt for extraterrestrial life elsewhere in the universe. We also discussed Carl's approach to science writing, including where he draws inspiration and his writing process. As always, if you enjoy the content of this podcast and you find it useful, please like, share, and subscribe wherever you're listening. You can subscribe on YouTube to get notifications of when new episodes are uploaded on the video podcast. You can support the podcast through a couple of mechanisms. One is to sign up for a Good Chemistry Patreon account on Patreon, and the other is to go to goodchemistry.locals.com and sign up to join the Good Chemistry community there. Today's show is brought to you in part by Dosist, an all-natural cannabis company specializing in dose-controlled cannabis products made with plant-based ingredients. To learn more about Dosist, their products, and where they are available, please visit their website through the link in the episode description. With that, here's my episode with Carl Zimmer. Carl Zimmer, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Where are you calling in from today? And can you give everyone like a short bio of who you are?
Well, I write books about science, and I'm also a columnist for the New York Times. And I'm talking to you from lovely Connecticut.
And how are things going over there right now in terms of COVID? Have you gotten a vaccine yet?
I have gotten the vaccine. I'm talking to you a couple days out of my second dose, so I've gotten through that challenging time of just relaxing on the couch while my body makes lots of spike proteins. So I'm feeling pretty good.
Cool. Yeah, I'm actually the same. I got it, my second dose 2 days ago. Which one did you get?
Pfizer.
Yeah, that was the same one I got. So you felt it a little bit after the second dose.
I felt a little after the first dose. I felt it a lot after the second dose. But, I just stretched out on the couch and listened to a podcast series for the afternoon. And next day, I was back in action.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining me. I'm hoping to talk to you mostly about your latest book. So I've got it right here. It's called Life's Edge. I believe it is out now. Is that right?
Yes, it is out and available at all fine bookstores.
So it's basically about this question, what is life, that many, many people have asked. And I immediately start to think about the famous one-liner from a Supreme Court case from a few decades ago that was about obscenity, where one of the justices is asked to define pornography, and he can't actually come up with a definition. He just says, I know it when I see it. And I think life is kind of like that, right? We all know life when we see it, and yet it's this concept, it's this thing that escapes a precise definition, or it's at least very difficult to come up with something like that when you try and stop and think about it. So just to start out with, what was the reason you decided to write about this topic, and why do you think it's such a difficult question to answer?
Well, maybe all of us have asked this question when we were kids, once we started using the word life or alive, and, ask our parents, well, what is it? And we probably didn't get a great answer from them. I was one of those kids and then grew up and became a writer. And I ended up writing mostly about the science of biology, which is the science of life. So I write about all sorts of living things, not just human beings, but bacteria and maple trees and jellyfish and just all sorts of things that we call alive. What repeatedly surprised me was just how difficult it was for biologists themselves to agree on a definition of life. There are hundreds of definitions published in the scientific literature by scientists themselves, and new ones keep coming out. So over all this time, scientists really aren't converging, I'd say, on some very clear definition. And I just find that fascinating because, pornography is one thing. I mean, pornography is a human creation. So, how do we define games? Like, what's a game? Well, that's complicated too, and for good reason, because it's a human activity. But life, like, that's something that's one of the most important things that science can address. And if scientists are struggling to define life, if they're struggling to draw a line between the living and the non-living worlds, I just find that fascinating. And what's really fascinating is that there are some scientists and philosophers who are sort of actively grappling with this problem. Why is it so hard? And does that actually tell us something deep about life, how life began, how we'd recognize it if it came in a very unfamiliar form on another planet? So it's something that sort of, this is a book that has bubbled up within me over many years.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that strikes me is it's very intuitive for people to think about being alive, right? We all are alive. We all feel alive. And one of the interesting things that you brought up towards the beginning of the book is that's actually not universal, because there are a small number of people that have a neurological problem that actually prevents them from feeling alive. So can you talk about what that syndrome was and how it originates?
Yeah, so this is called Cotard syndrome, and it's named after a French physician named Cotard, who in the 19th century encountered a patient who explained to him that she was dead. And, it seems kind of paradoxical. How can someone be dead and be able to tell you that they're dead? Well, this person had absolute conviction and had a very elaborate explanation about being dead. And over the years, from time to time, psychiatrists and neurologists have come across a few people who also will say they are dead. They will tell you how they died. They will explain to you how they're, now just an empty husk, how they don't take a bath because they know that they will just dissolve away because there's nothing alive inside them. And what fascinates me is that we sort of take it as sort of an objective, obvious fact that each of us are alive. So I know I'm alive. You know you're alive. But we never sort of question how we know that, because we think it's obvious. There are living people for whom it's not obvious. And in fact, what's obvious is the opposite. And so what I think this points to is that there are actually, brain circuits deep in our evolutionary history that are responsible for sort of monitoring our own interactivity. And we have sort of taken those as being kind of an objective reality. And that, or knowledge, whereas they're just these kind of, signals that our brains are using to then come up with other decisions on a very sort of deep subconscious level. So the fact that we know we're alive is really more of an unconscious response of our brains. And you can pull out, as it were, that's part of that circuit, and the brain will keep working, language will keep working, and yet people will no longer recognize themselves as alive. So I think that's maybe the first opportunity to the most intimate opportunity to stop and say, like, wait a minute. We're taking life and being alive and knowing that even yourself are alive for granted. So let's dig deeper.
Yeah, so humans clearly have this sense. We know that we're alive. We have rituals built around the birth of new life and also the passing of people that were alive. And I'm curious to get you talking about how deep this sense goes, how far back in evolutionary history it goes. At one point in the book, you talk about something called primate thanatology. So what is that? And what does it tell us about the evolutionary history of this awareness of life and death?
So thanatology is the science of death. So in a way, the question of what is life can be flipped on its head and say, well, what is death? There was a French physician in the late 18th century named Javier Bichat who said essentially that that life is the means by which death is resisted. So once death is no longer resisted, you're not alive anymore, you're dead. And so scientists have been wondering, well, what is the means by which we know that others are dead? People who with Catar syndrome think themselves are dead, but how do we recognize death in others? And again, that might seem obvious, but we actually we humans in the 21st century will use all sorts of various means to determine death. We might check someone's pulse and might say, like, well, if they don't have a pulse, then they must be dead. Unless, of course, the pulse is too weak because maybe they have hypothermia or something like that, and we just can't hear the pulse, can't feel it. So it's actually difficult sometimes to determine if someone is dead. This actually led to lots of practices, even in the 19th century, where coffins would be rigged up with strings and bells, so that if someone was accidentally given a premature burial, they could ring the bell when they woke up and they could be taken out of the ground. So then this sort of raises the question, well, how far back in human history were we aware of death? One of the best ways to look at this question is to compare our behavior with the behavior of our closest mammal relatives, the primates. So even before Darwin, there were British naturalists who were, as they were starting to move into British colonies like India, for example, and they would observe primates, monkeys, for example, and they'd be really struck sometimes by how a troop of monkeys might have some sort of visible change when one of the members of their monkey troop died. And they would describe it like it was grieving, that they would make these sounds that sounded like wailing, like grief. Now, how much of that is anthropomorphism? How much of it isn't? Well, that was a question that Darwin got really interested in because he believed that human behaviors connected with primate behaviors through evolution from a common ancestor. Much more recently, scientists like Jane Goodall would go and just spend time with wild communities of primates, in her case, chimpanzees, and just try to quietly observe them for long, long periods of time. And every now and then, a chimpanzee would die, and she would sometimes notice that they would do very unusual things, like a mother might carry their dead infant in a kind of peculiar way for a couple of days after it had died. So more recently, we've gotten a lot more data on this, and so it does, and there are some pretty elaborate explanations for how it is that humans, apes, and monkeys share some of the same kind of responses to death. And there's some pretty elaborate explanations that are being explored now. So part of it is that, again, death is the flip side of life in the sense that, we have in our brains very sensitive biological circuits for detecting life around us. So we have this feeling that we're alive, but we can also look around and we can pick out sort of evidence of life very quickly. Not in any sort of rational deductive way, but we are tuned to certain kinds of features of biology, like biological motion. So when animals move around in a sort of purposeful way, boom, like certain parts of our brains light up in a way that's different than if we just see like a rock rolling down a hill, just passively obeying physics. So we see that in each other, and not only do we see that kind of biological motion, but all primates are very keenly tuned to faces, and so you have you're looking at the movements of the face, you're looking at the expression of the face, and again we have quote unquote face circuits in our brains which are very keenly tuned to that, and that makes you aware of other living things that surround you socially. So, you want to be aware of predators that might come and jump at you, but you also want to be, very carefully keeping track of what, members of your troop are up to. How are you going to fit in the hierarchy and so on? Are you going to get ambushed by a rival or something like that? So when death comes, you have this member of your group, and it's looking at that member of your group. It lights up some of these biological circuits, but they may not be moving at all. If they've sort of collapsed, their body may be in some strange position that's very unfamiliar. You can't fit that into your sort of biological shape recognition, as it were. And their faces are no longer responding in the way that you're used to. And so it could be that for monkeys, at least, why is it that monkeys will spend a long time near other dead monkeys? Well, maybe they are needing time to process this mismatch, and then eventually they can recategorize members of their troop as dead. Now, in our own lineage, that became more elaborate. So you have, human relatives who start to bring dead members of their own species to these caves and seem to be leaving their bodies there. Is that a way just to kind of get them out of the way, or is it some sort of ceremony? We don't know. But then more recently, within the past 100,000 years, you do start to see evidence of what we'd agree are sort of full-on funerals where, bodies are being put somewhere in the ground in some cases, being decorated with flowers, with other objects. And so it could be that, through language, we develop a more elaborate conception both of life and of death, and that we carry that on until now.
So like the basic recognition that a conspecific has passed away might go back tens of millions of years in primates, but the fully modern conception of death that we would call the fully modern human view of death goes back perhaps 100,000 years.
Yes. I mean, again, when you're talking about human evolution, you often are having to just, you can't like point to a day on the calendar. You often have to like make brackets over periods of time, because all you've got to go with is the evidence, and the evidence can be fossils. The evidence can be comparisons between different species. In some cases, when you're lucky, it can be looking at genes. So yes, I mean there are clearly funerals in the archaeological record within the past 100,000 years. So it's then the question is, well, how far back do you go to the first funeral? How was it that simply hauling a body and putting it, say, in a cave chamber sort of changes from that into funerals with rituals and why did it change? Did it change because we started to think about life differently, life in terms of our existence within a society? These are fascinating questions. Some of them will get answered. Some of them may never be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm really interested in that conception of life that you mentioned a couple minutes ago, of life being the resistance to death. And I think that actually ties into concepts that people who think about this have brought up in the past around, life being in some sense a resistance to entropy, to the natural tendency of things to become more disordered in the physical world, and the homeostatic regulation of various forms of chemistry that seem to be characteristic of life. Before we get there, I wanted to ask you about a couple other things. There's various places in the book where you sort of look at really extreme out there forms of life to get at this question of like how far can life go? At one point, you bring up cryptobiotic species. So what is that, and how do their extreme abilities allow them to defy death in ways that are remarkable?
So this you can think of it as a third state between life and death. Now, that might seem impossible, like either you got life or you got death, and that's it. But the world doesn't really care about the lines that we might want to draw. And the first person to really appreciate this third state was Antony von Leeuwenhoek, who is one of the pioneers of microscopes. He built himself microscopes and used them to discover all sorts of things in the 1600s that no one else had seen before. Discovering different kinds of cells, discovering lots of single-celled organisms, and really kind of opened up this hidden world to all of us. He noticed one day, it was he noticed his gutter on his house was full of water. So it's like, well, let's see what's in there. So he scoops it up and puts a drop in his microscope, and he sees, odd little animals with what look like wheels on their heads. They're spinning around. These are microscopic animals called rotifers. And he's like, oh, that's cool. Okay, so I got this little zoo in the gutter of my house. Very interesting. What was really surprising was that, the summer comes, the water dries out, and there's this sort of like a kind of red caked dried mud in his gutter. So he's like, I wonder what that's like now. So he just goes and he cracks off a bit of this dried mud, and he, he's looking at it, and he decides to wet some of it and put it under his microscope, and he sees these rotifers again, but they're just totally, they have a strange shape. They're sort of squashed, and they seem like, as far as he can tell, they're dead. But when he takes a look at them later, their wheels are spinning on their head again, and they're just spinning around. And he's like, well, wait, whoa, these were dead, and now they're not dead. It's one thing for, seeds, for example, to go dormant, and that's a remarkable thing in itself. But, we think of animals as, well, they are
irreversible.
Right. They've got all these cells that are being very active, and then they may have circulatory systems. They have to keep up their metabolism. You're an animal, you're not a seed, right? So what was going on with this animal? And so then in the 1700s, other scientists would slowly discover other examples of this. Little nematode worms, for example, that they could be dried out and be in this weird state for years, and then just throw them in water and boom, they're back in action. So there have actually been just, this has been such a point of fascination and controversy for centuries, actually, because biologists are just saying, what is going on? And they have better idea of it now, but I wouldn't say that it's all figured out. My favorite example has to do with another little animal called tardigrades. And if you've ever seen a picture of tardigrades, you'll love them forever. They're so cute. And they're some people call them water bears, and some people call them moss piglets because they've got these 8 legs, no eyes, just this giant sort of weird snout with a sort of circular sucker-shaped mouth. And they just amble around on their 8 legs and eat and just do their thing on moss, in the ocean, all over the place. They're everywhere. What's kind of astonishing is that you can. It's really hard to kill a tardigrade. So, for example, like if we just locked you in a room and didn't give you water, you would eventually die of thirst. And and it would particularly help if we turned up the heat in the room too. I mean, basically, what would happen is that the water content in your body would start going down and down and down, and many of the proteins that carry out essential chemistry in your body just don't work anymore unless they're in enough water. So chemistry fails, you die, we're done. And that's irreversible. Like I can't come back in the room and just dump a bucket of water on your face and say like, hey, wake up. Like, that's it, goodbye. But that's not the case for tardigrades. So tardigrades, they can dry out, and they can stay dried out for decades. We actually don't know how long they can stay dried out. I believe someone recently told me that the record is a century, but I need to double check on that. I know that it's like over 50 years, but anyway, like it's kind of a hard thing to prove since it takes so long to test. But point being, these are amazing animals. So how do they do it? Well, it appears that as they're starting to dry out, they can start making a kind of a replacement for water. They make a certain kind of sugar, which has some of the chemical properties of water, and it can, so it will sort of sub in for water. It doesn't evaporate, so it's not going to disappear the way water did. But this, in a way, just buys the tardigrade time, because the long-term solution that the tardigrade is creating for itself is it starts making a very special kind of protein that just starts to sort of fill up its cells and basically kind of lock in all the other molecules in place. And so it's kind of like glass. So eventually you can have a completely dried out tardigrade that has been turned into this kind of protein glass. And that they will just hang in there in this state for a very long time. And you can scientists have put tardigrades on rocket ships and sent them into Earth orbit. They've gone into space. You bring them back, and then you give them some water. They're fine. They can handle the vacuum of space. They can handle the radiation they encounter there, because they are frozen into this third state, and what scientists will call cryptobiosis. There are probably a lot of other animals, some plants, and some fungi that can do something similar. We can't, but who knows? Maybe there are some things we can learn from cryptobiosis that we can harness for medicine, for example. Maybe there are some secrets there for keeping organs more viable for transplantation, or some other types of secrets for preservation. But who knows? Who knows?
One of the other interesting life forms that you spend some time on in the book are slime molds. And a couple phrases that popped out to me were, one person described them as a moving stomach. And for those who don't know what a slime mold is, we'll unpack it, but it's mold. It's basically slime. And so it's not that impressive at first blush, but these organisms can actually do very impressive things that we might characterize as problem solving. And they have, you say, a brainless kind of memory. So what are slime molds and how do they work?
So people may have seen slime molds without knowing what they were seeing. If you've walked in the wood on a summer day, you look down at a log or on the ground, you may have seen a strange little spattering of brightly colored blobby things. And those are slime molds. And there are hundreds and hundreds of species of slime molds around the world. They have all sorts of great names. My favorite is dog vomit, because that's honestly what it looks like. It looks like some dog went in the wood and threw up, but it's actually a living thing. And actually, when you're looking at that dog vomit or some bright yellow, strange sort of spattering of tentacles, these things can get to be the size of a teacup or even of a placemat. You're looking at a single cell. It's just one cell. It's not a multicellular organism the way we are, or the way a mushroom is, or a plant. It is one huge cell, and it's got DNA in it. It actually has its DNA, like ours, is packed into a nucleus, but it may have millions of nuclei inside of it. So that if the weather gets dry, part of it may break off and fly away. And if it lands in a wet place, it's got those genetic instructions inside of it to just start growing again into another giant cell. When two slime molds meet, they can have a very bizarre form of sex where they actually create an entirely new cell that has a combination of their genes, and then that goes off and does its thing. So I am really fascinated by slime molds because of the fascination that a lot of scientists have with it. It's because scientists, they would take a sample of slime mold and bring it into their lab to understand, well, how does it go about its life? Slime molds eat bacteria that they find growing on surfaces in the woods. And so you can actually feed slime molds in a lab. I spent a lot of time at a lab of a scientist named Simon Garnier, who's at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. And his favorite food for slime molds is just a few flakes of oatmeal. Because oatmeal, like lots of other things, has bacteria growing on it, and the slime molds love it. So if you put a little pile of oatmeal in a petri dish, and you put a little slime mold on the other side of the petri dish, very slowly, like over the course of hours, that slime mold will extend tentacles and will eventually reach the oatmeal and will envelop it. In the Simon Garnier studies a particular kind of slime mold called Physarum, which has these beautiful yellow tentacles. And so, within a day, that lump of oatmeal is going to be turning gold because the slime mold is feeding off of it. So that slime mold had to find it. And it doesn't have eyes, so it can't see it. And what it seems to do is it seems to have a kind of, maybe think of it as a sense of taste, so that as molecules are diffusing from the oatmeal across the petri dish, it can taste the flavor of this oatmeal from a distance and try to follow that taste towards the source. So that's pretty complicated. That's pretty interesting, but that's just the slime mold just getting started, honestly. So, for example, scientists can build a maze for a slime mold. So you just take little pieces of acetate and you lay them down on a dish and in basically create walls of a maze. And you put the slime mold at the entrance of the maze, and you put oatmeal at the exit of the maze, and then just go away. And when you come back, maybe in a day, the slime mold will have spread out and explored the maze and eventually made its way to the oatmeal. And what's amazing is if you take sort of stop action pictures of this, you can see that once it's found the oatmeal, it retracts its tentacles that were going off into dead ends. And so what you're left with is the shortest path through the maze to the food. You can have mazes where, there are several different potential paths you can take, but some are longer than others. It will sort of pare itself down to the shortest path because that's efficient. It doesn't have to waste energy maintaining a bigger body. It can just focus on eating the food. So scientists are finding that these slime molds are doing all sorts of astonishing things. They're almost like mathematical. They seem to be doing a kind of computation. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned memory. I talk about this in the book that you think, well, how could a slime mold have memory? It doesn't have a brain, doesn't have a hippocampus. There's no place for memory inside a slime mold. And the fact is that slime molds may not need to actually store their memories inside of themselves. They can create sort of an external memory. So what they do is they extend their tentacles in different directions. And when they retract their tentacles from a dead end, they can still sort of sense the flavor of having been there. They leave behind a signature of themselves. Mm-hmm. So slime molds will tend to avoid where they have been before. And this is so they can remember, in a sense, their failed explorations. And so that means that you don't waste time going in places that you tried to go before and didn't manage to get any payoff for it. You can you can sort of build a very simple experiment is to put some oatmeal on one end of a dish, put the slime on the other end of the dish, and then create a kind of a U-shaped trap between the slime mold and the oatmeal. So if the slime mold goes straight for the oatmeal, it's just going to hit this wall, the end of this U-shaped barrier. So what the slime molds will do is they'll go, they'll hit the wall, and then they'll sort of start to explore around a little bit. And eventually they just shoot around, they go backwards, back around the edge of that U-shaped wall, hook around on the outside of it, and then go around the outside to get to the food. So they're actually able to override that natural movement towards the food. They actually go backwards because they're just also trying to avoid where they've been. So that combination lets them do this incredible, sophisticated navigation through this space. So why is this in a book about life? Well, in Life's Edge, in terms of coming to terms with life, I wanted to look at what we think of as some of the hallmarks of life. What are things that things that seem to set life apart from everything else? And it's a combination of hallmarks. And one of those hallmarks that you see again and again is that living things have what Simon Garnier, who studies these slime molds, would say is intelligence. He has a very broad definition of intelligence. He thinks slime molds are intelligent. And intelligence is basically arrangements of molecules, in a sense, that are able to take in information from the environment, use that information to make decisions about what to do next. And those decisions are better than random. so that a slime mold is not just like going around randomly. A slime mold does a really good job of getting to food, and you can study that down to these its molecular components with a slime mold, because you don't have to worry about a brain or anything complicated like that. It's just one cell, and it has intelligence, and it's almost in its purest form.
Yeah, one of the things I want to talk about is the concept of homeostasis. And this is often brought up as one of these essential features of life. So we can look at something like a slime mold or a tardigrade or a human, and all of these things are very, very different in terms of how they behave and how they work. And yet they all share something in common. And that has to do with the fact that we share a common evolutionary history ultimately. And, we're not completely different. There's actually a lot of shared processes there. And you talk at one point in the book about this concept of homeostasis. And there's a quote you have in there from a very famous biologist from the 19th century named Claude Bernard. And he said, quote, "All vital mechanisms, however varied they may be, have only one object, that of preserving constant the conditions of life in the internal environment." So what is homeostasis in simple terms? And can we point to that as perhaps being the essence of life?
Well, it certainly is a hallmark of life. And what homeostasis is this stability. So life is remarkably stable even when its environment is changing. Now that stability can take many different forms. So, for us, for example, we have lots of different kinds of homeostasis. And if we lost any of them, we would die. So, for example, our body temperature generally stays incredibly stable, even when it gets cold or hot around us. We have all sorts of ways of keeping our body temperature at a very narrow band of temperature. And that's a temperature at which our proteins have evolved to work at an optimal way. Our blood sugar level stays at an optimal level, and that's true even if we haven't eaten for hours, or if we're in the middle of eating, a candy bar. Like we can keep our blood sugar very stable. And there are all sorts of other parameters that we keep really tightly controlled all the time. And it's just and these aren't things that just sort of keep themselves stable. They have to be maintained. Now, there are different species will have different kinds of homeostasis because they have different needs for staying balanced, but it's just a theme that you see over and over again throughout life. One example I really like is with bats. So when I was working on the book, I went to visit some hibernating bats in an abandoned mine in New York. So here were bats that were surviving winter in the Adirondacks, and they were doing it by going into this abandoned mine where the temperature is, maybe around 40, 45 degrees. And they had dropped their body temperature to that level. Now they were still breathing slowly, but they were still managing the oxygen levels in their body, so they had that kind of homeostasis. Their hearts were still beating, so they still had a certain blood pressure they were maintaining. So they had that inner balance. They just shifted it to a different kind of homeostasis that would let them survive for months without eating a thing. And yet, in the summer, these bats, they rouse out of their hibernation, they fly around, and they still keep their inner environment stable. Their temperature is much warmer, but it's stable at that new set point. You can even think about the way they fly. Like in order to fly, you have to stay stable, even if you're being buffeted by winds and such. And bats are amazing at doing that. You blast a gust of air at them, they might tip one way, but then they very quickly right themselves. And that is actually, I think, one of these universal principles of life. How does life keep homeostasis? It uses things like negative feedback. So it's in the same kind of system that your thermostat uses to keep your house at a certain temperature, or your car uses with cruise control. So if you're going up hills and down hills, it senses that you're moving away from the set point, and it has these negative feedbacks built in to bring you back. So again, we need these stable inner environments to sustain life, but we also need to sustain the inner environments with negative feedback.
So what about evolution? Is Darwinian evolution perhaps another one of these hallmarks of life? I know that at least at one point, NASA more or less defined life as any self-replicating entity capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution. And, defining life actually is really important if you think about the search for life elsewhere. We need a good definition of what it is before we can find it, at least if it looks, very, very alien compared to life on Earth. So do you think that Darwinian evolution is another one of these hallmarks of life?
Well, I have a chapter in the book about evolution because certainly, everything that we call alive is the product of evolution. And evolution is not something that just happened a long time ago and then stopped. Evolution is built into the process of life. Living things can reproduce, and in the process of reproduction, they pass down the genetic information that allows their own cells to function, their bodies to function. And when you copy genetic information, it's just a series of chemical reactions, and there can be what we would call mistakes. In other words, the new copy of some DNA won't be totally identical to the original one. And so these are mutations. And so this is the raw material for a genetic variation. And when you have this kind of variation that can be passed down to future generations, you have the opportunity for natural selection. So if there's any mutation that is really harmful or is really beneficial, evolution just takes over. It will make those mutations either less common or more common. So evolution is sort of built in to life as we know it. So NASA in the early 1990s, they brought some scientists together to talk about looking for life on other planets. And these scientists, after a while, realized, we really need to agree on what we're talking about before we start looking for it. And so they had a very long conversation. They weren't philosophers. They said they just wanted a working definition, something they could use for research. So something short, sweet, practical, and really focused on what NASA wants to do. And so they came up with this definition of life being a self-sustaining chemical system that's capable of Darwinian evolution. So the self-sustaining part is takes into account the homeostasis we've talked about, metabolism, and then being capable of Darwinian evolution. You've got the reproduction there, you've got the genetics built in. You're not saying that it has to be made of DNA, but we're gonna, they were just saying like we're gonna call life this. It's but it's tricky. I mean, obviously, it's really important to understand evolution to understand life. But if you go to another planet, do you have and see something and you're like, I think that might be alive. I don't think that's a rock. I think that's a living thing. Um, well, do you have to prove that it is capable of evolution before you will really demonstrate that it's alive? I mean, I can't prove to you that I can evolve. Like, I can't evolve. I'm just a guy. I'm a father of two kids. I don't know what their descendants will look like. Who knows? Here I am. So in a way, even though it was supposed to be a working definition, in a way it's kind of impractical because it doesn't really tell you what you're supposed to do with this concept of evolution, when you're on another planet and trying to figure out what you're looking at.
So is there anything special about the type of chemistry that we find in life? So, you mentioned DNA and the ability to replicate imperfectly, which gives rise to the evolutionary process. But is the type of organic chemistry that we see in life somehow different from the type of chemistry we see in the non-living world?
Well, certainly, when you look at some of the, molecules that make us up or that make up, a tulip, they are different than the kind of molecules that you will find floating around in interstellar gas or deep inside the earth. Living things can build stuff. They are sort of these blind Lego builders. They can assemble very complicated proteins and other structures. And so some scientists have argued that have put forward something. This is Lee Cronin, University of Glasgow, Sarah Walker, Arizona State University, and Kate Adamala at University of Minnesota. They've been exploring something called assembly theory, which is basically a theory that posits that maybe we can distinguish life from non-life by trying to determine how many steps it takes to build stuff. Now, these can be steps that just happen without the presence of life. Just, if you go to some hydrothermal vent, for example, where lots of minerals are surging around at the bottom of the ocean, there's a lot of weird chemistry there. And chemical reactions can build on chemical reactions and end up building something really weird. So these giant chimneys, they were not built by living things. It's just geology, geochemistry. But a big DNA molecule or even a hemoglobin molecule, a protein, like these things that it takes many steps to build them, and they're built in a very specified way. So so that is one way that maybe not only can we start to think about life theoretically, but also it could be a very practical way of looking for life on other planets. You might actually just not even have to visit a planet. Maybe you just look with your telescopes at the atmosphere of a planet, maybe in another solar system. And then if you can figure out the composition of some of the molecules in the atmosphere, well, maybe those are the kinds of things that have to be assembled. They don't just sort of form through atmospheric chemistry.
So the idea is that life assembles things. The assembly of those things, proteins or whatever, takes many, many steps. And it sounds like it's just sort of a fact insofar as we understand that, there's certain things, certain forms of chemistry that can't happen in just one step. It takes many, many steps. And that seems to somehow be tied to life.
Yeah, I mean, in one sort of preliminary study, Lee Cronin and other scientists said, let's just take a look at a huge number of compounds, just a vast, vast number of compounds. Some of them will be things we get from living things. Some of them will be stuff we pull out of meteorites. Some of them will just pull out of a rock or out of the air or whatever. And they had a sort of a procedure for basically, determining the number of steps through chemistry that could produce them. And basically, like anything that wasn't alive, they couldn't find anything that required more than 15 steps. Only, if you go above 15, only living things are there. So there are some components, some organic molecules that you don't need 15 steps. They're on the simpler end of things, but life is capable of this incredible elaboration, because once you got the system set up, essentially of just, the chemistry that we use and that life as we know it uses is just basically, I'm going to take an amino acid and I'm going to stick it on another amino acid. And then I'm going to go look for another amino acid. I've got, 20 or so to choose from, and I'm going to different kinds, stick that one on the end, and just keep sticking them until I got a chain. And then I let it go, and then it spontaneously folds into some very cool shape. And then, other proteins might sort of fine tune it, and there you go. So it's an open-ended process. I mean, you can keep just sticking on more and more amino acids onto a protein, and then you can then cut that protein into two different pieces if you want, or combine two proteins together. It's an open-ended creative process. That's one of the things that makes life so wonderful. And you can encode those proteins with genes, where you've got these genes have these four different sort of genetic letters, as it were, and you just have this amazing open-ended capacity to rewrite genes to make new proteins or new RNA molecules, so life has this capacity for assembly far beyond anything else that we know of in the universe.
So is anyone using this notion, this idea of assembly theory, to actively look for potential signs of life in planets outside of Earth right now?
They are. They're trying to develop some strategies for that search for extraterrestrial life. A lot of this is really going to scale up in an exciting way as astronomers put new generations of telescopes into space.
So one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is something that a lot of people have been thinking about for the past year, which is viruses. So we talked about homeostasis, we talked about Darwinian evolution. With those things in mind, are viruses alive or not?
Well, it does come down to what we think of as being alive. And so we just talked about the NASA definition of life. So there, according to NASA, in their working definition, in order to be alive, you have to be a chemical self-sustaining system capable of Darwinian evolution. So if we look at viruses, well, Darwinian evolution, they've got that covered, because viruses mutate very quickly, and they, every time that they infect a cell and produce new viruses, those viruses often have a lot of new mutations. Most of those mutations are harmful. A few may be beneficial. And so those beneficial mutations can help the virus adapt. It can adapt within our own bodies, and it can also adapt over longer timescales going from person to person. And so, it is this evolution that gave us our COVID-19 pandemic by a coronavirus that adapted to humans, having been in bats originally. And the coronavirus is continuing to evolve, and it's branching into new lineages. Some of those lineages have mutations that are increasing their transmission, and those are becoming dominant. So we can see that viruses are capable of Darwinian evolution right in front of us. They're not self-sustaining in the sense that maybe NASA meant. NASA was thinking, these scientists, if you ask them, they were thinking about homeostasis and metabolism. And so that's taking place inside of cells with all sorts of complex chemistry, proteins that are regulating each other, feedback loops built in, genes making new proteins when they're needed, proteins being destroyed when they have to be gotten rid of. This incredible choreography that goes on inside of all of our cells. Viruses, you look inside a virus, there's none of that. There are some genes. Usually those genes are held in place by a protein, and that's it. So the way that viruses are able to replicate and to evolve is that they just go into a host cell, they infect a cell, and their genes are used by the cell to basically rejigger the cell itself so that it is now all about making new viruses. One of the scientists involved in the NASA working definition of life is named Gerald Joyce. And he was once asked, well, what about viruses? And he was very clear about it. He said, well, according to this working definition, viruses don't make the cut. So, a lot of scientists will tell you categorically that viruses are not alive. However, there are scientists who will tell you that viruses are definitely alive because they can evolve, because they're so important in ecology, because they are so important to the web of life. We have viruses. Viruses have contributed to our own genome, for example. We have hundreds of thousands of pieces of our DNA that came from viruses. So you've got those people arguing that viruses are alive. And then you have people who are kind of in between. So there's one French scientist named Patrick Forterre who argues that, well, when a virus is just floating along on its own, it's not alive. However, when it goes into a cell and infects that cell, that combination of the virus and the cell is now a new, distinct, living entity. So the virus gains this life every time it infects a cell. That in a sense, that cell is the virus because the purpose of that cell is now to make new viruses. And it is remarkable when you look at what happens to a cell when it gets infected by, say, the new coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2. You can see it looks different. The cell builds little incubation chambers for creating and fine-tuning new viral genes. It doesn't do any of the stuff it needs to do for itself to grow and to divide. That all stops because it's now all of its chemistry is in the service of making new viruses. So this question, is a virus alive, is not settled, but it's unsettled in the most interesting way possible.
One anecdote that I did want to ask you about that came up in the book, it was from an episode in the early 20th century. So there was this guy named Henri Bergson, and he wrote a book. This was a philosopher, I think. He wrote a book called Creative Evolution, and apparently it was a bestseller at the time. It was like a popular science book. And you even write that when he traveled to New York to deliver a series of lectures, he reportedly caused one of the city's first big traffic jams. So who was this guy? What was this book about? And why was there so much discussion and debate around it?
So Henri Bergson was a French philosopher who was, he wrote a number of books. Well, perhaps the most famous one is the English translation is Creative Evolution. And in a way, Bergson was reacting against the modern science of biology that was emerging at the time. There had been a tension ever since the scientific revolution in the 1600s about the nature of life. because in the 1600s, physicists were starting to think about the world as matter in motion. So you have matter that is passively being moved around by mechanical forces, and you can explain all sorts of things this way. You can explain how planets go around the sun. You can explain why it is that a cannonball fired at a certain angle will land in a certain place very far away. It's predictive, it's powerful, and it leads some natural philosophers, these are sort of the predecessors of scientists, to argue that, well, living things are also explained through these mechanical forces. These would sometimes be called mechanists. René Descartes was perhaps the most famous of the people who saw nature this way, and really saw animals and other living things as essentially machines, merely in the sense that you could explain them as parts that were moving to carry out certain functions in response to just understandable forces, mechanical forces. And there was an opposition to him from other thinkers who argued, no, well, there's got to be, you can't just reduce life to mechanical forces. It's not just matter in motion. And these people would sometimes speak of a vital force. So there was some sort of vital force that organized living matter, that gave living things the goals that they sought. They're eating to survive, to reproduce. It's not just a random movement of particles. Eventually, these people became to be known as vitalists, often in a derogatory sense. And this tension between sort of mechanism and vitalism, it really, it's fascinating how that's the debate over what is life for centuries. So getting back to Henri Bergson, Bergson is writing at a time when, the mechanists have turned into biochemists. In other words, they have been able to understand living things in terms of enzymes. They're starting to see some of the reactions that carry out these vital, essential processes in life. And so on the one hand, this is very exciting. I mean, the biochemists are saying, look, we are unpacking the secret of life. But for a lot of people, this was very unappealing. It really felt like you're just, again, reducing nature to just these molecules that are passively responding to these forces. And so that, we're quote unquote just chemistry. So Henri Bergson, he was not a scientist, but a philosopher, but he built into his philosophy, what you might call neo-vitalism, in the sense that he still believed that there was something beyond this kind of physics and chemistry that defined life. And in fact, that there was something that propelled life forward, that evolution in a way, there was some sort of almost mystical force that was propelling evolution to more and more higher and higher levels of complexity. And maybe the universe was carried along in some direction. Now his arguments, I'm not doing justice to his arguments because they're a lot more complex than that. But I will say that he was incredibly popular. I mean, Creative Evolution was a huge bestseller. And as you mentioned, he may have created the first traffic jam in New York when he showed up to talk about it. So people were hungry for this kind of view that sort of elevated their lives above biochemistry. But the biochemists themselves, I think they found that talking about vital forces and vitalism just wasn't helpful. Because all these people were doing is just pointing to things that we do not yet understand. And that's not that's not really evidence of anything. It's sort of like saying like, well, we don't know how whales evolved because whales couldn't have evolved because we don't have any fossils of whales with legs. That's true until you find a whale with legs, which scientists did in the 1990s. So that's no longer a thing. But at the same time, the spirit of vitalism, I would argue, and I talk about in Life's Edge, it endures because, you do need to talk about life beyond just Newton's laws of motion or the rules about, the bonds between atoms. There are higher levels of organization in life that you have to recognize in order to make sense of life. You don't have to be a vitalist to recognize that, but in a way, some of the questions that vitalists had even 100 years ago have yet to be answered.
Do you think that perhaps a modern answer to the vitalists comes from things like assembly theory, where it's not merely mechanistic and just pointing to the biochemistry, but a key aspect of that theory is that there is something special about the way that information flows through things that we call living systems, that the information is in a sense controlling the way that the matter organizes itself. Does that seem right to you? And can you just unpack what that thinking is around assembly theory?
Well, assembly theory, in a way, kind of sort of takes it as a given that that life is capable of this sort of open-ended creativity that I was just talking about. How life was able to start assembling in the first place actually is a very hard question. But certainly, you mentioned information, and information probably is, part of the answer to these big questions. People think of information as, in terms of like, computer files. And so they might think of information strictly in terms of, well, what's the information encoded in genes? It's a legitimate thing to think about information that way, but physicists will also talk about information in lots of other contexts. They will often talk about, well, if you know about something, how much uncertainty does that reduce about what you know about something else? And you can actually sort of trace that reduction of uncertainty through a system. And physicists will call that a flow of information. And cells have very interesting flows of information, the ways that proteins interact with each other and interact with genes. Proteins switch some genes on and turn them off in response to things that are happening on the outside. The flow of information is very peculiar. It's and that might be a clue about a theory of life that is based on information. That full theory does not yet exist. There are other theories that involve the dissipation of energy, for example. So, if you've got a tree growing in your yard, energy is coming into the tree is absorbing energy through photosynthesis, and then it's eventually releasing that as heat. But it's really good at that dissipation of energy, and in the process, it is building its wood, its bark, its leaves, and flowers, and making new trees as well. So there may be something about how it is that matter dissipates energy, that under certain conditions you get this sort of self-organization that is so distinctive of life. And so it may just happen spontaneously when you get the parameters just right. A scientist named Jeremy England has done a whole lot of work on this particular view of life, and it might help to sort of, in a sense, show how life is an inevitability. You set up a universe like ours, sooner or later, somewhere you're going to get life.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about your writing process. So you've written a large number of books at this point. Would you say that you have a writing process for your books? Like, do you decide that you're going to write a book about a topic, you start writing and then you finish writing and you're really focused on that book? Or is it more of an organic thing where you're sort of writing articles and taking down notes over time and eventually you have an assemblage that you then recognize is potentially book worthy?
Sometimes I just decide I want to write a book on X, and I just go out and I do some research on X and just outline the structure of a book and then write it. So for example, some years ago, I got interested thinking about the brain and how was it that we came to see ourselves in a sense as our brains, or that, our brains were where things like emotion took place, reasoning, and so on. Like, when did the brain become the center of our existence? I thought, well, that would be, I'd be curious to know what the answer is. And I started looking around, starting to go beyond the history of neuroscience as I knew it then, and just started digging deeper, and just was fascinated to discover how neurology was invented very quickly in the mid 1600s by just a few people. Most interestingly, an English physician named Thomas Willis. He actually coined the word neurology and published the first book just about the brain. It included the first really accurate pictures of the brain made by Christopher Wren. And I was just like, wow, I want to write about this. And there was no book about this before. So I wrote a book called Soul Made Flesh. So there was a case where, I just said, okay, I'm interested in this subject. I'm going to do a book on it. There are other cases that are more like what you just described, where I will just be going about my business as a journalist, writing newspaper articles for magazines like The Atlantic or National Geographic. And then after a while, I might kind of look back at a few years of material and think, I seem to be continually gravitating back to a certain question. Maybe it would be good to just stop and take all that material as the starting point and dive deep and really, really try to bring it together into some kind of unified story. So I would say Life's Edge is one example of that. Also, the book I wrote in 2018, my previous book, She Has Her Mother's Laugh. And there, I was writing about heredity, which was something that I had been writing a lot about in various forms. What as scientists were able to analyze, DNA from millions of people and start to reconstruct our genealogy and look at how we're related to each other. What was that telling us, both about heredity and about maybe the ideas about heredity that we share that we're wrong about? Things like epigenetics, which were really coming to the fore, and I've been writing about. And CRISPR, in a sense, is the manipulation of the future of heredity. And I was writing a lot about CRISPR as well. So at one point, I just said, wait a minute, these 20 or 30 articles, it's all about the same thing. So maybe I need to create one thing where I really explore this in a unified way and dive into the history as well.
So when you're actually in the midst of writing a book, say, so you've decided that you're writing the book, you're writing it, maybe you even have a deadline you have to hit. It's no longer just an idea. How regimented is your writing process? Are you, some writers describe a very regimented process where every morning for 4 hours, sit down and write no matter what. And others have a very different style. How would you describe your approach to actually doing the writing and sitting down to get it done once the project is underway?
Well, certainly once you sign a contract, that does clarify the mind, and you're not going to just sit around at that point and just wait for inspiration to strike, or you're not going to only write when you only feel at your very best. So yeah, I mean, you need to be writing or researching every day, whether the muses are looking kindly on you on that day or not. Even a lousy day of writing is better than not writing at all. And at least you have raw material that you can go back to and look at and say like, oh, wait a minute, I can see why this is so terrible because there's something else I need to be talking about. Or if I flip this chapter upside down, it's great. So I don't think I do hear sometimes stories of writers who say like, I get up at 5 a.m. and, have a bowl of muesli. And then from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m., I do nothing but write. That's not me. I might, some days I'm writing very late at night. Other days it's the morning when I'm writing. Some days, it's it's kind of a slow creeping, crawling process. Maybe I'm just realizing I have to stop writing and do a lot of reading or call someone because I don't really understand what I'm writing about. And then other days I'm just on a tear, and I really, I'll tell my wife like, I'm coming out for dinner, but then I'm going back in because like I don't want to waste this role that I'm on.
Interesting. And is there anything else actually that you want people to know about Life's Edge that maybe we didn't cover?
Well, one thing that I find interesting is that, I went and spent time with a lot of scientists who are really thinking about life at its extremes. So, for example, one person I went to talk to with was Lori Barge. She's an astrobiologist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And what she's been doing a lot of work on recently is thinking about these icy moons, such as Enceladus around Saturn, as possibly being where you can find life. So Enceladus is covered in ice, but there's a liquid water ocean under there. And as the moon goes around Saturn, there are these tremendous tidal forces that kind of stretch out the core of the moon in different directions, and that generates heat. So you have this energy source and a liquid ocean, and lots of interesting chemistry happening. So what's going on under the ice? She would like to know. And so, NASA is thinking about maybe sending some probes back out to places like Enceladus to really figure that out. And what's fascinating to me is like, I will talk to someone like her and say like, well, do you use this NASA definition of life? Is that, what would something have to be for you to decide that it's life? And, she says actually she tries to avoid definitions of life because they get in the way. She wants to just learn as much as she can about what's going on Enceladus. What is the chemistry there? It could be very interesting chemistry that's just the result of these hydrothermal vents at the bottom of its ocean. Could get some very weird structures, some very weird molecules, and that'll be cool. And maybe some of them will be starting to replicate in some peculiar way. But she's not about to sort of say like, well, if it's not life, I don't care. She wants to go there and to get some ideas about life that maybe she didn't already know. And when you talk to philosophers, they will actually say that, well, we should have this more sort of open-ended exploration of life rather than arguing about what is the definition of life. one philosopher I spoke to named Carol Cleland put it this way. She's like, essentially, it's like you're in 1500 and you go to an alchemist and say, well, what's your definition of water? And you can look at books of alchemy and see what they said. They would say things like, well, water is something that's transparent and is liquid. Water is wet. It can dissolve certain things. That's just a list, like saying like life is something with homeostasis and metabolism and evolution. And the problem with lists is that, well, you have this situation like, okay, the water gets cold and now you have ice. Is that water? The alchemist has to look at his list and say, no, I guess not, because it's not liquid, so it's not water. And also you'll have different kinds of water. You have things that are transparent and liquid and can dissolve metal. So you need to give them, so they must be a certain kind of water, a royal water, it might be called. Now, if you went forward 300 years, you could talk to a chemist, and a chemist has a theory of matter now, a theory of atoms and molecules, elements, atomic, starting to get ideas of how atoms form molecules. And now you can start talking about water in terms of a molecule of hydrogen and oxygen, two hydrogens to an oxygen. And, eventually through experiments and modeling and so on, you can understand how it is that what we call liquid water becomes ice through the change in the arrangement of those molecules. So, we're kind of at the point now where we're in the before times. We're before that theory that could account for life. And there are people working on that theory right now. It's very exciting, but we're not there yet. And, maybe we will live long enough to see it. There were people who, for whom superconductivity was a mystery. And then Einstein tried to explain it and he couldn't, and others tried to explain it and they couldn't. And then someone did. And then we had a theory of superconductivity, which was a really important thing for physicists. So maybe one day we'll have a theory of life, and that will be better than a definition of life.
Well, Carl Zimmer, thanks for your time. The book is Life's Edge, The Search for What It Means to Be Alive. It's a great read, and it's out now. So thanks for writing the book, Carl, and thanks for talking to me today.
Thanks a lot. It's been a real pleasure.